My good friend Brendan Kearney, a San Francisco native and proud graduate of the University of San Francisco, where he earned his BA in government, has 31 years of dedicated service as an infantry officer in the United States Marine Corps. Brendan commanded at the company, battalion, and regimental levels. His impressive career culminated as Chief of Staff at Marine Forces Europe, with half of his service spent overseas, including a combat tour in the Persian Gulf during Operations Desert Shield and Desert Storm. During his time in the Marine Corps, Brendan also earned an MS degree in National Security Strategy from the National War College and was honored with a fellowship in international security from MIT's Seminar 21 program. Transitioning to the high-tech industry, Brendan specialized in humanitarian and disaster relief. He worked for Sonoma County, administering a federal anti-terrorism program for Napa, Sonoma, Solano, and Marin counties. Many of us met Brendan at our live GGBC meetings during the final role as the director of the Living Memorial at the Marines Memorial in San Francisco, focusing on military history and veterans programs. Brendan's commitment to service extends to several civilian board positions, including the Wine Country Marines, the Marines Memorial Association, the Knights of St. John, and the Devil Pups program. He consults as a military political affairs analyst with the local CBS television and radio affiliate in the Bay Area, and serves as an analyst for BBC, radio TV, Turkish radio television, MSNBC, and NBC News. Brendan's career reflects his dedication to his country, his community, and the people he has served alongside. Please welcome Colonel Brendan Kearney, talking about Ukraine and update. Thank you.
Patricia and Bill, thanks very much. Very quickly, I'll tell you, the first time I was introduced to the Breakfast Club was when Bill invited me down there to the Marines Memorial. This is probably around 2006. But your speaker that day was our current Democratic candidate for president. She was then serving in her role as DA for San Francisco. So I have very fond affection of a lot of the members, a lot of the faces I see. But I'll get right to it. I'm going to move at the speed of light because I'm covering 2,000 years of history in an extraordinarily complex situation that is, it belies most Americans' minds as to where we've come from to get to where we are now. So why do we have this horrible conflict ongoing? It's unimaginable that we have a conflict in the center of Europe. Over 500,000 casualties. The Russian forces are suffering 1,000 dead a day, some days of the week. It is just an awful, awful situation. But to understand it, to even have a hope of grasping why this is going on, you have to think about the power of history. And Americans as a culture are among the worst in the world when it comes to understanding history, let alone geography. And I'll talk a little bit about geography here in a second. But what do you look at when you look at Ukraine and Russia? If you study Ukrainian history, they make out Russia as being subservient to them over the last millennium, except for the period of the Soviet Union. If you look at Russian history, they look at Ukraine as being subservient to them over their last millennia. So it's an interesting quandary that we Westerners have when we look at that. What's the ground truth? And I would argue good luck in finding it. I'm not sure anybody really knows. But the key things to understand about the absolute power of history is that the Europeans and the Russians and the Ukrainians right now view history as having occurred last weekend. All right. It's not like your average American citizen where you ask them on the street, when did the Battle of Gettysburg occur? And they give you a blank stare. These peoples in that part of the world have a tremendous understanding. And unfortunately, the understanding also brings with it grudges, envy, all the bad things of humanity. And I'm going to mention just a couple to draw your attention to. Ukraine in the 1930s. Up until the 1930s, Ukraine, I heard agriculture mentioned here a couple times. 1800s through the beginning of the 1930s, Ukraine was considered the breadbasket of the world. It was only knocked off the pedestal of being the greatest supplier of wheat and agricultural products in terms of coming out of Odessa on the Black Sea in the 1890s, when America's Midwest, because of the cessation of the Indian Wars, America's Midwest suddenly became the powerhouse, the agricultural powerhouse that it continues to be until today. So what happened? Well, Stalin, in his infinite wisdom, and I say that very facetiously, describes or decided, along with the Soviet hierarchy, that they wanted to go ahead and collectivize the farms. Up until that point, they had been a private farming, as we with serfs and all the things that we've read about with Russia, Ukraine, and that part of the world. Well, what you got was, as a result of that, is you had a man-made famine in one of the richest agricultural areas in the world. The numbers are questionable, but there's some agreement that anywhere from 4 to 8 million Ukrainians starved to death during a very short period of time. So that obviously, there's a grudge there about the Soviet Union and Russia, because the blame, when it comes to the Soviet Union, the former member states blame Russia. World War II, 7 million Ukrainians were killed, along with most of Ukrainian Jewry. It's just a fact. Ukraine was the battleground. And they were the source of not only a significant number of the Soviet army, but they were also the production center for most of the Soviet tanks, their artillery pieces. They, on top of being an agricultural center, were an industrial center. And that will play a role here when I talk a little bit later on about innovation, the power of innovation, and what the Ukrainians, why they're so good at it. So post-war, what happened then? Well, Khrushchev started with Stalin again post-war, before he died. Then Khrushchev and the other leaders of the Soviet Union decided that they had to build. They saw some cracks in the Soviet Union in World War II. And what they decided to do was diminish the inherent nationalism of the Union republics, the 15 Union republics of the Soviet Union. The way they did that was through internal forced migration. So what you had was a couple million Ukrainians forced from Ukraine and spread throughout Russia and other portions of the Soviet Union. And likewise, several million Russians forced into Ukraine, and primarily into the eastern portion of Ukraine that borders Russia, and also into the Crimea. And that plays a role here many, many decades later. Unintended. They didn't know that what was going to happen, but it certainly does. Now, it was one of your members mentioned here, the Budapest Memorandum of 1994. I sat in the office of the Ukrainian equivalent of the Secretary of Defense in 1994, just before they signed the memorandum. He looked at me and he told me the only reason they were signing this thing was because the United States was guaranteeing that when they and Kazakhstan and Belarus turned over their nuclear missiles and warheads, that the United States and the UK, along with Russia, would guarantee their territorial integrity. The United States Senate never confirmed that treaty. However, I would argue to anybody, it doesn't matter that they didn't do it. We pursued, or we inherited, a moral obligation to come to Ukraine's defense. People don't like hearing those words, moral obligation, but to some Americans and some Brits, thankfully, and also other Europeans, that carries a connotation of obligation that you have to follow through. Let me talk just a little bit about geography. There's an area just north of Ukraine. It's about 10 miles wide. It borders Kaliningrad, Lithuania, Belarus, and Poland. And it's called the Suwalki Gap. the Suwalki Gap has been the route of invasion for the last 10,000 years, both going from what we now call Russia into Europe and from Europe into Russia. And that area, it's very easy to look at. You can find it on the map, little farmland, nobody's there, little town. But that area is key to the control of Europe. It's key to the control of Russia. And that needs to be left demilitarized. It needs to be, we don't need armies going back and forth there. We may or may not fail in preventing that. The other thing you have to understand, because occasionally people start talking about Belarus and what Belarus may be in terms of its potential if they were to invade in a southerly direction across towards Kiev. There are the Pripyat marshes. It's 104,000 square miles of marshland that the Germans spent 3.5 years in utter failure trying to get their forces through there. No one goes through there unless the inhabitants of the Pripyat marshes let them go through. And that still remains a barrier. That's the power of geography. I would argue the most important thing Americans and Western Europeans in this vast technological world we live in now seem to forget is the most important device needed on the eastern front or the western front of Ukraine is a pick and shovel. That allows you to dig fast and dig efficiently and get underground, because that's your only protection against artillery and some of these very, very high-tech, sophisticated weapons. It's still that important. And always remember that the infantryman today, and Bill will attest to this, the infantryman today of any country walks no faster than the Roman legionnaires did 2,000 years ago. Doesn't matter how high-tech we're talking about. We're talking about basic humanity and trying to survive. So I talked a little bit about the power of history. If you go outside of Kiev on a Sunday afternoon, I think they're still doing this because it's so imbued in the Ukrainian spirit. You will see families parked along the side of the road and they have designated little spots and fields. And you'll see the family laying out a picnic-style evolution, and you'll see the man wearing a coat and tie and using a hoe and going into that black soil to raise the vegetables and the other instruments of their culture. And it is so important to them, and that's their tie to the land. And that is why Ukraine values Ukrainian land so much. And that's why there's no easy solution to the Russian incursion. Now, I want to get in very quickly, and I know I've got a time limit here so we can have some Q&A, but Ukraine in 2014, again, a multi-generational, the animosity between Russia and Ukraine cannot be understated. Those Russians that I told you that were forcibly relocated to the eastern part of Ukraine, they're culturally Russians. They speak Russian, and Russian and Ukrainian are different languages. They can mostly understand each other, but they are very proud of their own dialects. And a Ukrainian will plead ignorance just like a Russian will plead ignorance if somebody speaks to him in the opposite language. So it's a fact of life as to how that works. The Russians that are living in that part of Ukraine, what they do is they were complaining to Russia that they were being mistreated. Was there mistreatment? Yes, there was mistreatment. Was there pogroms or anything like that going on? Absolutely not. It's just they were the outsiders. The Ukrainians look at them with resentment, and they made it clear they didn't like them being there. But there was no efforts to eject them from the country or anything like that. Putin, Putin's the man quoted repeatedly as saying the greatest tragedy of the 20th century was the dissolution of the Soviet Union. He wants the Soviet Union to come back in some way, shape, or form. He wants to have all the countries that border the Soviet Union to become a new, quote, near abroad, unquote. That's the buffer zone that Russia wants to have to prevent those invasions from occurring again. And it's extremely important to the Russian psyche, and we have to respect that. That doesn't mean we have to go along with it. And that's what Europe and Ukraine is saying right now, along with some of the other former republics of the Soviet Union. Anyway, remember the little green men of 2014. Russian infiltration into eastern Ukraine of their Spetsnaz, their special forces, occurred over a period of months. The Ukrainian leadership at the time had were pulling the ostrich move. They had their head in the sand. They were ignoring it. They were believing what Putin was saying about peace, peace, peace. We don't want to fight with our brother Ukrainians, anything along those lines. Again, big surprise, lying through his teeth. Winston Churchill once famously said that if you go ahead and deal with the Russians, you have to accept the fact that they will lie to you as you're talking to them, knowing full well on their part that they know, they're lying. And Putin was lying. However, he pulled off a minor miracle in terms of a military occupation. Yeah, he was successful. You have to hand it to him, particularly when you now go fast forward to 2022, the tensions continuing over a period of time. Of course, a new leadership in Ukraine, a TV actor. What type of leader is that going to be? As the world has found on a couple of occasions, they may tend to, the media types may tend to do some pretty interesting things. Anyway, the Ukraine was invaded in 2022. 3 days was what the Ukrainian or the Russian plan was in order to overwhelm the Ukrainian defense. The Ukrainians, from the very start of the invasion, showed that they had applied lessons learned from 2014, and they had determined that they were never again going to be embarrassed on the battlefield as they were in 2014. They had an emphasis in their military on pride and confidence. They built their overall morale. They got with the United States, with the UK and other Western European nations, and they cherry-picked the best tactics, techniques, and procedures and taught their own military those things. They started a non-commissioned officer corps. They started a junior officer corps. They built this all up very, very quietly. I'm hoping someday, before my time on Earth dies, somebody publishes a book as to how they did it. It's fabulous that they were able to pull this off. And basically what they did is they devastated the Russian invasion. The Russians were overconfident. Everybody knows that. They underperformed. They were utterly incompetent in many respects. Their logistics, their command and their control, a chronic lack of professionalism, their technology shortfalls. We had placed the Russian military on a pedestal of holding them up as saying these guys are really they have the peak of technology. Some of the early aircraft that were shot down by the Ukrainians, the Russian pilots at their own expense had gotten civilian GPS and taped them to the inside of their cockpit. They're ineffective, but yet that's how they were trying to overcome what we thought was a high-tech military. Their comm gear didn't work, and we couldn't figure out in the West why isn't it working? The Russians have been experts at radio electronic combat for generations. Well, the soldiers beforehand, the Russian soldiers, had stripped the wiring out and the batteries out and sold it to buy vodka. We found this across the board. Some of their tanks didn't have their internal wiring. It was an extraordinary surprise to the West. The Russians implemented the draft in the face of the rising casualty rate that they were at, an extraordinary casualty rate. 1 million of Russia's most talented men voted with their feet and left Russia to escape the draft. So on top of all the casualties they're suffering, there's 1 million people who walked away, crossed the border into Georgia, they crossed the border into Ukraine, and then continued on west. It just an absolutely astonishing thing occurred to include in the Russian military the killing of their own senior leaders by their men. Again, the Russians have no very small non-commissioned officer corps, and they're noted for their brutality. They seem to have this penchant towards beating up the young draftees, which is not good for retention, I guarantee you. And they have a very ineffective junior officer corps. Everything is driven down from the top. There's no initiative. None of the things that the West, those of us who've served in Western militaries, fully appreciate and fully understand. You have to have if you want to have a successful military campaign. So where are we today, 2024? Let me address NATO. Ukraine's going to end up being in there. There's no doubt in my mind. However, I think NATO is wise to wait until some type of peace breaks out in that part of the world. But then Ukraine's coming in. I just see that happening. The Russians, their problems continue in critical areas of leadership, morale, logistics, command, communications, control, intelligence. Again, they're not displaying any initiative, any innovation. They don't seem to have taken any aspect of lessons learned and tried to apply those at all across the board. Ukraine continues to improve upon their already superb military performance. They're hitting targets now. The West took the gloves off, which was stupid on the part of the U.S. administration and some of their Western allies with giving somebody weapons and then telling them, putting limitations on their use. This is war. This is a country defending itself. They should be allowed to use those weapons any way they want. And now we're starting to let them do it. By striking into Russia, that adds complexity, a dilemma, increases the dilemma to the Russians because they have to take military resources and spread them throughout Russia in order to protect their bases. So I think we're going to see more and more of that going on here. The Black Sea Fleet, defeated literally by a non-existent Ukrainian fleet, again, with innovative use of drones, of seaborne drones, extraordinary effort on the part of the Ukrainians. But there is no more Black Sea Fleet. They've basically abandoned Crimea and gone into the eastern portions of Russia, the western portions of Russia that border the Black Sea. And they're hunkered down in the ports, looking and hoping that nobody can find them and send some more drones at them. The F-16s that were promised and the pilots that were trained are all supposed to arrive this coming month. They may play a role in somebody finally taking decisive command of the air. Neither side has been able to obtain air superiority. If the Ukrainians get air superiority, the situation on the ground is going to dramatically change to Ukraine's advantage. Putin, what's going to happen to Putin? No one knows. We don't know if he's really ill. Is he going to die tomorrow? Is somebody going to take him out? Good luck with that crystal ball. The other aspect is what happens if Putin does go. We don't know who's going to follow him. We have the visibility on that succession leadership and whatever their plan is just non-existent. We don't have spies in Moscow anymore. The Russians have very few spies in this country anymore because of all the ejections that took place over the last number of years. So our knowledge of Russian leadership and the potential changes, it becomes one of those situations we have to be careful for what we're wishing for. Are the hostilities going to cease anytime soon? I don't know. They could stop tomorrow if there was a change in Russian leadership. The brand new, most senior British officer the other day was quoted, the equivalent of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the UK, the Imperial General Staff. He's predicting 4 years and 1.4 million more Russian casualties. But he qualifies it also the same way I am. We just plain don't know. But we know that the level of hostilities and the deaths of innocents and all that is not, the numbers are not decreasing. If anything, they're increasing. I mentioned the Ukrainian penchant for innovation. They're extraordinary. They're like the Israelis. You give them an old piece of gear and turn your back on them for a few minutes. The next thing you know is they put some new high-speed stuff in it, new engines, upgun the equipment, new electronics. They're really good. Someone mentioned there that acoustic device that apparently we're interested in. I'm not familiar with it. I wrote it down, so I'm going to have to go get familiar with it because sadly, I study these bleak things on a daily basis, whether it's Ukraine, Gaza, or what may potentially happen between China and Taiwan. That's my lifeblood. And finally, before I turn it over to questions, I want to say something. I'm apolitical. I'm a patriot. If any of our politicians start talking about how they deserve credit for the reinvigoration of NATO, look, they're lying to you. They're lying to their teeth, either through ignorance, sheer stupidity, or a desire to make themselves tougher guys than they really are. There's only one person that deserves credit for the reinvigoration of NATO, and that's Putin. He took a organization that was flailing around, and I was part of NATO for 3 years of my military career, flailing around, didn't know what it was going to do, looking for a mission, and Putin gave him one. And also expanded the membership by going ahead and convincing two historically non-aligned nations, Finland and Sweden, that it was in their best interests out of fear of Russia to join NATO. So with that, I will thank you for putting up with a very, very fast-moving 2,000 years or so and current thing. And I'm open to any questions that you may have for me.
That was absolutely amazing. We expected nothing less. It's wonderful to hear modern situations based on historical perspective. You did not disappoint the billing. And of course, your pal Bill Buchanan is the first one to put his hand up.
That's so I won't forget my question. Brendan, I'd be going on for half an hour and congratulating you on a very granular and thorough overview of the conflict. But at one point you mentioned the fact that one of the one of the reasons that the Russian Federation used for attacking Ukraine on the east side was that there were a lot of Russians in those provinces that were being mistreated by the Ukrainians. There is a piece of land between Latvia and Estonia or something like that. It's called Kaliningrad. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
The old port city of Danzig.
Is there a possibility that, depending upon the way this conflict goes, where it turns out in favor of Russian Federation or Europe, the NATO forces, is there a possibility that he might try to pull that same ploy that the Russians in Kaliningrad are being mistreated and then try to drive a wedge in there?
It's a great question, Bill. Kaliningrad has Russian troops stationed there. There's speculation there's nuclear weapons there. It is thoroughly run by Russia. However, your premise does apply to another area I didn't get into, and I won't go into great detail, but it's the independent state of Moldova, down there between Romania and Ukraine. Moldova, there's the Dniester River, the Transdniester area was where the Russian soldiers, when they retired, their leadership back in the Soviet Union days, that was their Florida. That's where they went to have great fruit, drink lots of wine, and live high in the hog. There's about 28,000 Russian troops down there, and it's a constant sore between Moldova and Russia. So that's where you may see additional trouble developing.
Great. Colin Hussey, then Doug Bauer, your questions.
Oh, my video is somebody could start my video again. I just don't see Putin, this aging old czar trying to remain relevant in the world, winning this? I mean, how sustainable is this war effort how economically sustainable is this?
It's a great question. First of all, aging czars or aging leaders that are into mischief. I mean, look at Stalin, look at Mao. They exist. They seem to prosper. They don't want to give up. But Russia has been hit hard by the sanctions. And of course, the problem with economic sanctions is they take time to take effect. He's being supported by, I think, money from China. And he's also going ahead and focusing most of Russia's economy towards the war effort. So I think this is going to go on for a much longer time in terms of their ability to sustain it. He simply won't let go, which is sad because this is not good for Russia. And of course, obviously, it's not good for the world.
Doug Bowers?
If from the period of March 22, April 22, somewhere in there, if the US and NATO had been much more supportive of the Ukrainian effort to defend itself, where do you think we would be now?
Quite honestly, I think the conflict would be over. And the reason I say that is if there had been a full-out effort, somewhat similar to what's going on today in terms of munitions and getting that to the Ukrainians, because the Ukrainians rapidly started to run out, particularly artillery ammunition and small arms ammunition, and that's what's making the biggest difference on a front where it's stalemated with no air superiority. But what the Russians started and built and have expanded is the largest minefields in the world have been put in over the last 18 months in the eastern Ukraine. A very aggressive effort on the part, and aggressive in the sense of resupply, not putting troops in there or anything like that, would have allowed the Ukrainians to obtain the initiative and the momentum to go ahead and, I think, eject the Russian forces from most of Ukraine. May not have gotten them all the way back to the border, but we'd be much further along, and I think the Russians would have had to have gone ahead and ceased hostilities, or at least the level of hostilities that have been ongoing since then.
Good. I would like to ask two questions. One, is there any way you know how the everyday citizen in Russia are feeling about the war, if all the finances are going that way?
I have some contact with some Russians through social media. There's a split. There's a number of Russians who are drinking the Kool-Aid, who believe what Putin is saying, that this is NATO aggression. NATO, thumping that into the Russian head. And it's human nature throughout all the civilizations of the world. If you can go ahead and paint a country that is internally in trouble, and Russia was internally in trouble, and you can create an outside aggressor, it's a unifying force. It's a sad part of human nature, and he's managed to do that with some Russians. And of course, he's jailed or killed the vast majority of critics that he has from internal to Russia. They've had to leave, and of course, once they leave, it's harder to get that word into Russia. Although they are likewise. When it comes to computers and the internet and things like that, the Russians are very adaptive, and their news, the honest news, they're getting through the internet. They're not getting it across the airwaves at all.
I hold my second question because Brian Head has his hand up.
Yeah, thank you for that excellent presentation, Colonel. I was wondering if you could give us any insights into apparently a few months after the initial invasion, there was talk of a negotiated settlement. And then Boris Johnson, the British Prime Minister, went over and apparently encouraged Zelensky to nix that agreement. I was wondering if you have any insights how that played out or what happened.
You know, like you, probably similar to all of us that follow this on a regular basis, there have been rumors to that effect, but I simply don't know. I can't, you know, and I have a great deal of respect for all the leaders in Europe, all their foibles, all their failures, you know, but I find it hard to believe that any Western leader would stand in the way of the possibility of some type of cessation of hostilities. I mean, especially early on, my gosh, the horror stories that were coming out of Ukraine about, you know, the institutionalized rape, the movement of Ukrainian children into Russia, the devastation, the targeting, which unfortunately is still going on, of non-combatants. It was just awful. So I would hope that that wasn't the case, but I simply don't know whether there, you know, I can't assign any veracity to those reports.
Thank you.
Sure.
All right, Bert Hill and then Roger Carlson.
Yeah, I was the one who mentioned the the acoustic thing. I put it in the chat. It was in the Economist, dated July 24th. You can probably find it there and use, I think it's ZVOOK is the key word for it. You'll find it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, and now our guest, Roger, you have a question.
Yes, I've noticed the drones have changed the face of war to favor the offense more. It's like repeating rifles and automatic weapons came. So I'm curious if how much Taiwan has been following this, and hopefully even as sending a few advisors over and getting some design things from the Ukrainians. You know anything about Taiwan upgrading their drone defenses?
Yes, and they are. They are pursuing. They are watching what has gone on in Ukraine with a great deal of intensity. I spent 8 years of my career. My actual in the Marine Corps parlance, my area of expertise is East Asia, and lived over in Okinawa off and on for 8 years. So Taipei was an hour's flight away. The question mark for Taiwan, and I'll address this just very briefly. I'm preparing a presentation on that. We don't know the will of the Taiwanese people. They've lived in relative peace. The Ukrainians, we know what happened to them. They were embarrassed in 2014. They have a cultural animosity that does not exist between the Taiwanese and the mainland Chinese. So we don't know if the Taiwanese, no matter how sophisticated the weapons are, how innovative they are, what is their will to fight, their will to defend? So technologically, they are pursuing everything they can, and they will do it overtly, and they will do it covertly. They've been our friends for a long time, but they used to pose some challenges even to the U.S. military in terms of very aggressive intelligence gathering efforts on their part. So it's ongoing. I'm sure of it.
Mm-hmm.
Unless you have a second question, can you remove your hand up? Because I don't know if Doug and Bill have a second question.
Mm-hmm.
And no doubt Bill does have a second question.
Thank you, Patricia. as you know, Brendan, part of my career was trying to figure out what the KGB and GRU guys were doing up on Green Street, right? So here we have the former KGB officer who is in charge of the Russian Federation. And there was some intelligence, not really intelligence, in the public media that Putin was sort of hinting at some point, I forget exactly what the timing was, that if things don't go his way militarily, he might consider nuclear weapons. I don't know if that was, overplaying the interpretation or whatever. But what do you, I mean, this is a guy out of his mind. I mean, what do you make of that assertion, knowing that, going back to the 60s, there is the possibility of mutually assured destruction, especially when he's facing, the massive traditional military force and the nuclear capability of the NATO forces. I mean, do you have any idea of why he would even hint at that sort of thing?
Well, I hate to say it, in the most basic terms, I think he does things like that and periodically hints at it because of his tough guy machismo approach to life. There is no utility to the use of nuclear weapons in this type of conflict. Tactical nuclear weapons, the use of those on the battlefield, they pose as much a hazard to the user, the person who's using them, as they do to the receiver, the person who's getting hit by these things. I grew up in the Marine Corps where we studied the use of tactical nuclear weapons, and the consensus of virtually every one of us that looked at them was don't use them. They're more of a hindrance than they are to anybody else. And the winds in Europe for significant portions of the year blow from west to east. Any nuclear weapons that are exploded over there are going to expose Russia, the Russian people, to the after effects of that. And and Chernobyl proved that. When Chernobyl went in Ukraine, those decades ago, they were the winds carried the stuff up. The Norwegians were irritated, the Swedes throughout the Baltic states, because they were picking up the traces of this stuff in the reindeer blood. So it's not a wise move, but this guy is not a genius. At one point, a lot of the Western world looked at Putin as being a genius, and he clearly is not. He's a thug. And I think as soon as you start to look at his actions in terms of thuggery, then it becomes one of those things where you start to understand, okay, I dislike what he's doing, but I understand the mentality. He's a punk. That's all he is.
Yeah.
Patricia, you're muted.
Sorry, Susan Rowan, and then a second question from Doug.
Okay. I remember at the end of the Obama administration that they found a Russian spy group here in San Francisco. The gentleman that was arrested, and I'm not sure if he was deported, etc., what his cover was a popular chef. But they went in, they found him at the Russian embassy, they got him deported. So that was what, 2012-ish, whatever. Are you saying that you said there are no more spies here for them or there for us, but we always hear about potential Russian assets being courted. So is there still that possibility that some people here are being courted as Russian assets?
Yes, to answer your question, and I didn't mean to say, or if it came across that there are no Russian spies in the United States, I didn't mean that. There are. There are Russian sympathizers here in the United States. There's elements of the, and quite frankly, this is a sad thing to say, there's elements of the Russian Orthodox Church that are very, very much interested in any Russian activities that help Mother Russia. So this is ongoing. What I wanted to specifically say is that the overt Russian spies, the ones we knew about, and the overt U.S. spies in Moscow that they knew about, those numbers were vastly reduced. Vastly reduced. The American embassy in Moscow at one time had, I think, 800 U.S. citizens assigned to it through the Department of State, all the other, the commercial attaches, military, all those numbers through mutual assured reduction of personnel. The Russian embassy has been vastly reduced. They closed the consulate on Green Street.
Yep.
They closed the consulate, I think, in Dallas and LA. And the Russians have done the same with the American consulates. So our diplomatic presence for both countries is greatly reduced as opposed to what it used to be.
Yeah, and then instead they're arresting basketball players and journalists as spies.
Right. Yeah, I know. Back to the Cold War for some of us.
Pardon my interruption. I keep putting my hand up and it keeps disappearing. I have one.
Okay. All right, Gordon. Well, we acknowledge first questions before second questions.
Well, I haven't had a first question.
All right. I know, but so what is your question?
Well, in listening to today's presentation, with Sweden and Finland now being a part of NATO, and I suspect when this is resolved, Ukraine will become part of NATO. What do you think the resolve will be of the NATO nations to retain a cohesion? Because other groups like the United Nations don't seem to have the backbone to enforce their decisions. And how do you foresee NATO's resolve? And thank you very much.
Sure, thank you, and an excellent question. NATO is looking at out-of-area operations, and they did out-of-area operations in Afghanistan with varying degrees of success. The countries that contributed and actually put forces into Afghanistan to work as part of that U.S.-led coalition over there had varying limitations in some respects, and I don't mean to slight anybody, so I won't mention countries' names, but some countries sent their forces into Afghanistan, and what they did is they basically got onto Bagram Air Force Base and never left. They didn't do anything. They avoided combat. They had rules of engagement that were so restrictive. It was kind of in many respects, it was a bit of a failure. Other than that, NATO came together with ostensibly an agreement to do something. And that do something is now expanding into the Asia Pacific. There has been talk about Japan having a liaison officer in Mons as part of NATO. And that's kind of been turned off a little bit because they don't want to aggravate the Chinese. But there is a great deal of worry in Europe about this increasingly aggressive China and what that portends economically and also militarily. But NATO, if Ukraine was to go away tomorrow, which we could all pray for, a peace was to break out, NATO would once again, I think, find itself in the short term arguing about money, arguing about contributions. Again, the structure of the institution being a little bit shaken. But again, all you have to do is see that China scares people, and its impact on international trade in the South China Sea and throughout the Asia Pacific has got Europe worried. So it's a long way to go for NATO, but it's a long way to go for it still takes 22 days if you sail under the Golden Gate to get to Subic Bay in the Philippines in an amphibious transport ship. It's a long way away. It's even further for the Europeans. But NATO will find a reason to continue on.
Wonderful. I disappeared for a moment, and you're obviously all working very well without me. All right, Alan Garber, this is your first question, then Doug's second question. And then Carl Walsh has got his hand up. So, all right,
Hello?
Hello. Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, can you hear me?
All right, yes.
Okay, thanks, Brendan. Talking about NATO, I'm very much concerned what's going on in Israel and Gaza, and now with Lebanon and Hezbollah. And we just, in the last few days, a NATO member, Turkey, has threatened to attack Israel. And I'm wondering what repercussions would happen if Turkey were to actually try and do something like that. Brendan, you have any thoughts on that?
I do. I served with the Turks. I have a tremendous respect for them militarily. Wonderful people, great culture. I'm not sure. I don't want to offer my opinion about their current leader. But Turkey has been a question mark. You know, they threw that here just a year and a half ago. They really became a speed bump in the accession to NATO of both Sweden and Finland. That was overcome through some private assurances, as I've been led to believe. It would not be good for the expansion of any level of hostilities by the Turks against Israel.
Right.
It would be terrible for the Middle East. And I mean, we're on the verge of some really, I do a lot of media work, particularly with the Brits, with BBC, when it comes to what's been going on in Gaza and now what potentially may be going on south of the Litani River in Lebanon. This is really a very, very sad situation for the innocents. The only thing I'll mention about that is that anybody who thinks that Hamas and Hezbollah care a whit about the Palestinian people,
They couldn't
get
care
yourself
less
into
about
alcohol rehab, because that's where you need to be. These are criminal terrorist organizations,
Right.
and for the Turks to side with them is just it's awful.
I agree.
All
And you're right.
Carl,
You're right. Hamas does not care about the Palestinian people. They're just used as a tool to shield them from weapons that Israel will go to attack Hamas. I'm done.
All right. Carl, Janelle, Doug.
I just hope that the colonel can come back sometime to discuss the Asia Pacific situation. I can say just from my own eyes on Oahu, 8 months there, I saw a huge increase in military activity there. Or the 8 months that I was there, the aircraft passing over the house and going out to sea, there was quite a lot of activity going on. And I'm just curious as to what we're doing there. Back to you.
Well, I'm sure Susan Rowan and our ears are pepped up. We can certainly talk to Brendan about another presentation early next year. So Janelle and then Doug.
The internet has been going through something today. I have two related questions. The first question is how do we evaluate news sources? For example, why should I believe you any more than I should believe somebody who's an expert on Ukraine who reports on any of the big news media? And I say that with respect. I mean, how do I, as an individual, how do I possibly evaluate what is being reported. And then the second question is what do you think, as an expert in this area, is the best place to get news about Ukraine that we can trust? Because it's coming in so many different directions and hear so many different things. All I can do is rely on how I feel about that news as it comes through.
You ask a great question, and I fell into this media stuff through pure happenstance. And it's just with Ukraine coming on, it blew up from just being here in the North Bay with KCBS and KPIX to all of a sudden getting phone calls in the middle of the night from BBC and Turkish radio and television and folks in Singapore and Cuomo and all these different ones. I don't accept money. I don't get paid for this at all. I don't want to, because I think when you get paid by somebody, you start to position yourself in a situation where they may hold some type of influence over you. And quite frankly, the only person who holds influence over me is my wife, and she's pretty tough. In terms of where to get there, I look at CNN, I look at Fox. I really like BBC because for the most part, I've found that their news people are clearly the most. It's either higher education, the better education, whatever. They ask the best and most probing questions. And again, oftentimes I have an hour's preparation time where they'll say, are you available? Can you get up on Zoom? And we'll just have these great conversations. Sadly, some of the American, and I won't mention any of them here because they're all nice people. I've gotten to know a lot of them. Oftentimes they will ask me to tell them what questions they should ask me. And that to me is just not how this is done, and let me close by also saying that some of the talking heads that are on TV are highly, highly paid, extraordinarily well paid with retainers. And oftentimes what they say, and again, I spent 31 years in the military and I've been studying this part of, I've been a fan of Russia since 1971, when my Russian teacher at USF was a former subaltern in the Tsar's army, a great guy. And I became very, very interested in Russia. But I'll tell you, a lot of these people talk in terminology, in acronyms, in gobbledygook that I don't understand. And and quite honestly, I don't think some of them know what they're saying. So I won't mention any specific names, but I really try to just look for a balanced approach. And if I amass an opinion, I try to keep my opinion out of it, but I base it on very, very strong knowledge, a background of history, and understanding of geography. And I'm a practitioner of the military art. I did it for 31 years, and I still follow it to this day. So hopefully that answered your question.
It sounds like you're saying follow the money for one thing.
Yeah. And wherever the money is, be aware that there's an agenda behind that.
Right.
The web is the best. I cruise the web every day and look at BBC, look what's on Fox, News Nation, some of the Economist, Wall Street Journal, you name it. There's kernels of truth in all of those. All of them do a pretty good job. You just have to glean through it all because there's a lot of chaff in there. And a lot of people, unfortunately, a lot of the young reporters that are aggressive, gung-ho, they want to get into the war zones, they're the least experienced. They have no earthly clue as to what they're talking about. I mean, really, they don't. They have no understanding whatsoever as to what's going on around them.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm just about as
I think we're stuck again.
Have we lost Patricia? I think we have. All right. How are you on time, Colonel?
I'm good for about another 10 to 15 minutes. And then
Okay.
I'll have to scoot for a mission I'm on.
Excellent. Well, Doug has had his hand up for a long time. Let's go over to
Well,
him.
but he's already had one question, hasn't he?
Yes.
And so
Okay.
we have Derek Arden, who is asking his first question.
Oh, okay.
So
Go.
I'm trying to give everyone a first question before we come around to the second question. And before suddenly I was lost, I was asking Brendan, it is after 9 o'clock. Are you okay to stay with us?
And I'm good for about another 15 minutes, Patricia. And then my wife's got me on a mission.
Okay, good. All right, Derek Arden.
Okay, I hope you can hear.
UK member.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
That's the first question. Good, brilliant. Thank you, Colonel. That was a fantastic presentation. I really appreciate that. I'll be watching the BBC News in a minute because I'm in Guildford near Heathrow Airport. I'm not a big fan of the BBC News, actually. I prefer Sky. The BBC seems to report all the emotional things, but maybe the BBC Worldwide News is better and more accurate. My question is, we've just had a change of government over here who've slashed all sorts of spending and badmouthed the previous government, which is fair enough. But over here, we feel that your next president may slash the NATO fees that come from America. And how would that land with new NATO countries that are worried, like Sweden and Finland and Estonia, who are really concerned about what might happen next?
It's a great question. Obviously, the potential new president, one of the two, has been very critical of NATO in the past. However, in the last 4 years, there's been a dramatic and very, very significant increase in the amount of monies that the NATO countries are contributing. There's also been some talk. Your new administration there in the UK is talking about reinvigorating the British military, which unfortunately, I'm a huge fan of the British military. I served alongside them in the first Gulf War. The military in Britain has been allowed to fall to a level that is, quite frankly, I think it's unconscionable. But that I'm not a British citizen, so I'll hold my comments any further than that. But we have to remember, and this is what I tell BBC has asked me a number of times, this specific question that you just posed. We have to remember that the President of the United States has very, very significant power when it comes to what the U.S. can and cannot do. However, it is the Senate of the United States and the Congress of the United States that have the power of the purse, and the Senate of the United States that has the power for treaty obligations. And as long as those obligations are in place, the president would be very, very hard pressed to go ahead and abrogate those responsibilities. I think both with Ukraine and tangentially with Israel, there is tremendous support in the Congress for both those countries. NATO has gotten a lot of the criticism has died down from the Congress. And quite frankly, the criticism for decades was justified. Some countries simply were not carrying the load. And other countries were more than carrying the load, the United States being the principal one. But that situation is changing. And I think for the good, for the betterment of the organization. NATO, Europe, sadly, is rearming. Europe has to rearm. The biggest military in Europe right now are the Poles. And they're doing that because they fear Russia. Not so much fear in the sense that they're worried about them. The Poles repelled the Soviet invasion in the early 1920s, and they're more than happy to do it again. And they're capable of doing it. Europe, we never thought this was going to happen here since 1945, but here we are. We have a conflict, and it's not going away anytime soon. If peace broke out in Ukraine tomorrow, Russia will remain a threat in that part of the world.
Thank you very much.
All right. Doug's second question, Bert Hill's second question, and then we'll see where we are time-wise.
I don't think we can get enough of you, actually. It's presentation's been tremendous. How important is Crimea, and when and how did Russia get a foothold there?
Crimea is extremely important to control of the Black Sea. And for 1,000 years, Russia has been envious and desirous of a warm water port, access to the oceans. Crimea is great for that. However, there is a couple legal implementations, and the Turks are the ones in control of the Bosporus. So they're the ones that get to enforce an international treaty there about the passage of capital ships and everything else, armed naval vessels. So that's a bit of a hindrance there. But Crimea is extremely important to Russia, emotionally, historically. But again, like I mentioned at the very beginning of my presentation, the Ukrainians view Crimea as part of Ukraine. And historically, they may have justification. The Russians certainly got in there for a while. You know, Russia, they called it the Great Game. Russia and the UK and the fight over Afghanistan and portions of India and Pakistan, because the Russians wanted to get to the Indian Ocean, and the only way they could do it was through Afghanistan. And that was in the late 1800s, early 1900s. It went on for years. The subterfuge, the spying, it makes for quite an interesting read about that period of history between those two great countries.
Bert Hill, your second question.
Just I live in, okay. Yeah. The Economist, as I referred to, is probably the best that I know of knowledge about world affairs, particularly the Russians, from my experience in passing them. I was lucky enough in the 1980s, I was sent over to help the Russians with an economics teaching system on economics up and down Russia. I traveled all the way from the Kremlin. We organized it inside the Kremlin, and I traveled all the way from Kalinin down to Volgograd, and I learned an awful lot about the Russians, the Russian people, the personality, and the way they work. They're fascinating, but yeah, you have to be very careful.
All right, so there is no question, just a comment. All right,
just a comment. It's just yeah, very interesting people.
All right. Now I have Alan Garber and Susan Rowan with your hand up. Do you have a short, specific question and no comment? Because we're going to lose Brendan in 4 minutes.
I have.
Yes.
Please tell me, we have a big Russian mafia, or maybe I've watched too much Law and Order. Is the Russian mafia, because I know there's some here, New York, are they any threat? Are they any connection to Russia? Is there anything we should fear for them other than regular mafia stuff?
I think there were 3 sub-questions, and the answer to all of them is yes, yes, and yes. We do need to fear them. I think organized crime, and it is in this day and age, as opposed to, the Irish mafia in Boston and the mafia in New York and the Italian mafia, Sicilian mafia in Chicago, New York, and all the ones we're so familiar with in the movies. The transnational nature of what these organizations can do now and the harm they can do, both because of drugs, human trafficking. I mean, we could probably get Bill to talk, wax poetically about just how bad these organizations are and what they really can do to harm nation states. It's tremendous and sad, but these guys are enemies of our country. And whether they're Russian, or like here in California, with some of the Mexican gangs, some of the gangs coming out of Venezuela. It's awful what some of these organizations are capable of doing.
All right. Final question, Alan Garber.
Well, I don't really have a question. Just a comment, Brendan. I want to show everybody. This is today's front page of the Wall Street Journal. American weapons to boost capability of Ukraine F-16 jets.
All right, Brendan, you have your concluding remarks based on that, or anything else you want to say?
I've got
Before you go to your commander with your honey-do list.
Yeah, my commander-in-chief.
Yeah.
Yeah, is my last sergeant major used to say. He says she's the sergeant major. You got to do what she says. So, first of all, I want to thank everybody. Bill suggested this, and he did it without having heard this presentation. I've given it a number of times here in the Bay Area. I really, really enjoy this stuff. I'm a little weird that way, but I have a passion for history, and hopefully that's come across. It was great to see a lot of very, very familiar faces here. I'm sorry that COVID shut us all down in 2020. We were just embarking on some really interesting things in cooperation and collaboration with the Breakfast Club. So I wish all of you the best. Reach out when you feel like it for next year. I'm putting together. I haven't completed it yet, but I've got a request from one of the clubs here in the North Bay to do a. They liked this presentation, so they're bringing me back to do China and Taiwan. And also happy to talk about Israel and Gaza. I'm very experienced over there a number of times to Israel and the IDF. But thank you all very, very much. I better get going or I'll be in trouble. And
all right. Thank you very much indeed. We appreciate it. And it's nice having someone local in case we have a cancellation, Susan. We always know whatever Brendan talks about, the club will have a high attendance, and look how many people are still here. So that's wonderful. Lauren Ward and Gary McKenzie came in late in the background, and wonderful, wonderful group. We hope that you will be with us for New Kids on the Block. And Derek Arden, I'll introduce you to Brendan if you want to talk to him about being on your chat show. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your dedication to the Golden Gate Breakfast Club, and please invite your friends. Invite your friends. So with that, see you all soon. Bye.
Okay.